Next up, we're gonna start to implement the diagram that we kind of sketched out here. We're gonna go create, we got our users table already. Let's actually take a look at the app. We've got a listing of 10 stores. What we're gonna kind of pretend here is that we don't want every user to be able to see all of this information. So we're gonna kind of go through and kind of lock down certain portions of this app so that only certain users can see it. So for example, if someone's not logged in, we probably still want them to be able to view this like root page. Maybe we allow them to see, like, click on a store or something like that. But maybe we don't allow them to see, like, users, orders, and items until, I don't know, until after they've authenticated or, like, logged in. They should probably also be able to log in. That seems important. And the approach we're going to take here is we're going to go and do something similar to, like, BDD, like behavior-driven development, only we're not going to write tests. So I'm going to just keep coming back to the browser and refreshing. But I'm going to take the same steps when it comes to like writing the code that we would take if we were behavior driving the code. So I'm going to write the code that I wish existed, and then we'll figure out how to make it work. So kind of the same structure, same process there. But I wanted to save some time. All right, so here we go. Let's open this up. I'm going to go ahead and open up my editor. And as it stands, like I can click on all of the things, and all of the things load. We're going to slowly start to rip out some of this functionality, and it's probably going to be broken for a little bit here. So the first thing I think where we should start is probably with like an unregistered user, someone who's not logged in. Let's lock everything down so they can't see anything except the root page and then maybe a store. So maybe they can like hit these two routes. So like stores index and stores show, and we'll block everything else off. So let's get going here. I'm going to open up my application controller. Up until this point, when you've kind of had to lock things down at the controller layer, how have you done that? So I think about the scenario with like admins or something like that on previous projects. How did you protect against someone who wasn't an admin from accessing an action that they shouldn't be?
Callback method, or
yeah.
Test whether they're admin or not.
Right.
Or any action.
Exactly. Yeah. So like a before action, right? That kind of checks and says, hey, make sure this person's an admin. We're going to do something kind of similar here, but we can't just say, is it this one role, right? We have to now check against like multiple different roles. That logic would get really cumbersome to have inside of the controller. We could totally do it in here, but let's say we get 20 roles in the future. Our before action would be like huge. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a PO row. It's going to handle this logic for us. If you think about what it means to visit a page, this sounds like I'm being philosophical. But I'm not. Like in Rails terms, like if you really think about what we're trying to get access to, what is it that we're trying to get access to if we're trying to visit a page?
Some kind of information.
Yeah. What class are we interacting with? Maybe at some point, but even before we get to the presenter portion. What are our routes? Like when we're visiting a page, we're hitting the routes. That's the first thing we hit, right? And the routes send it where?
To a controller.
A controller, right? So that's the class we're trying to access. We're trying to access a specific controller. And then the specific page within that controller corresponds to what inside of the controller? A method, which we usually refer to as an action. Yeah, right? So when we're trying to visit a page, we hit a page in the URL, or like a path in the URL. What it actually is sending us to is a controller and an action. So with those two pieces of information, we can start to, like, if we know what controller they're trying to hit, and we know what action they're attempting to hit, and we know what user they are, we can say, are you allowed to see this, or aren't you? And those are the three pieces of information that we're going to work with throughout the rest of this year. So, as we discussed, we might do something like before action, right? And then send it somewhere to a method. I'm just going to call authorize I'm gonna do authorize bang, just because like if they're not authorized to view the thing, we're gonna do something about it. Like we're gonna probably like redirect them or send some sort of message or whatever. We'll talk more about exactly what we're gonna do in a little bit. But I want it to be clear that like something's going to happen if they're not authorized. This is totally gonna fail because then I come back here, there's not gonna be a method defined for authorize. And so this is what I mean, where I'm gonna like write the code I wish existed and then kind of figure it out as we go.
Is this an example of polymorphism? So if we have an authorized method that basically is going to return the state of the user, like, so I think of role as like a state. So my user's an admin,
Okay.
that's like their state. And so we're basically sending it to one object with one method that's going to then return different things based on what the thing
Oh, I
is.
see what you're saying. I think of it, I don't think this is a quite polymorphism. What might make this polymorphic is like if we had multiple controllers, like maybe like different layers in the application that maybe all had an authorized method.
Gotcha.
And maybe like they define it slightly differently based on like the portion of the application that we're trying to hit.
Okay.
I think that could potentially fall into that. Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. So we're failing right now, because we haven't defined authorize. So let's go ahead and do that. And we should be able to load, right? So now we're good. We've got the method defined. Only it's not actually doing anything. I think the first thing to do is make sure that we can not see maybe items. Let's just block off items and see if we can prevent a visiting user from hitting this. The easiest thing here is like if we had a test to make sure that they weren't able to visit it, we could just like essentially like return the equivalent of like, I guess that's like that we should make that decision now. What do we want to do if they're not authorized? Some people might do like a redirect and like send them to a different page or something like that with a message that says you're not allowed to view this. I personally don't like that. I think it leaks a little too much information to someone who might be trying to do something malicious. So what I would rather do is just return a 404 and just say the page you're looking for doesn't exist, kind of a thing. That's actually how GitHub does it. If I open up, let's see, GitHub, Turing School, we have like an assessment challenges repo. This is where our assessments live, but this is not a public repo. If I try to go visit this, what the public sees is a 404. And I like this behavior because it doesn't give any kind of like hint that there's some data here that's private. So we're going to take that same approach. I always forget how to do this in Rails. Rails return 404. There's a way to do this in the controller rather than like one way we could do it is just like render the 404 HTML page. But I personally like this a little bit better. This action controller routing error not found. It allows us to test for it specifically. So that way, if we're trying to write tests around this type of behavior, we can check and make sure that the specific error gets raised. When this error raises, it's going to return a 404 in the process. But in development mode and stuff like that, we'll get some more, development mode and test mode, we'll get some more useful information. That way, if it happens accidentally, we can like debug it a little easier. So let's see. So I'm going to use this line. So basically, what I'm thinking. Oops. Oh, come on, I lost it. Is we're going to raise this 404. Well, let's just see what happens when we just leave it this way, right? Because a default user should have this raised when they visit this items page. So let's refresh. Cool. And this looks like an error, but it's actually not an error. This is exactly what we wanted. If you look at the message up at the top, it's routing error not found. So this is exactly what we told it to return. And this is not what a user would see in production. They would actually get the 404 HTML page. But because we're in development, it leaks more information to kind of like give us some hints at some stuff. If I inspect element here, I can look at the network, and if I refresh this page, I should see, where does that live? Here we go. You'll see that the status code that we get is 404. So we're getting a 404, but this is just like a little bit more of like a Railsy way to do it, so we can write tests around it, get information, rather than just seeing an HTML page, which is kind of nice. All right, cool. So that's working. But what's not working now is now we also can't visit the home page, right? So we were able to block off everything in the app, but we're not able to see the home page. Let's open that up. And this is where it starts to get a little bit trickier, right? Because like we could do, in here we could write some like if, well, we would have to figure out like exactly how to tell what they're trying to visit. I can't remember if this has pry or by bug. I think it might be pry. So let's refresh this page. Go to our console, and here we go. We're trying to figure out again what are we trying to figure out, whether they're trying to access what two things specifically? It is items in the routes. It's corresponding to what? A controller and an action. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So anyone know how I can see which controller and action I'm trying to hit?
It's request. Not sure.
Cool. So we do have this request object that will have a bunch of stuff inside of it, all kinds of things. But there's actually an even easier way. Anyone know? And I think it is in there. Yeah, I think it is in there.
Yeah.
Has anyone just like looked at params before, without any actual other params in there?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of interesting, right? Like you've been working with params for a long time and probably missed the fact that the controller and the action are hanging out in there. And every request is always there. So we can actually take these two pieces of information, the controller and the action, and so what I want to do is, instead of doing it directly inside of the controller, is I want to write the code I wish existed. And the way I'll write that is, I wish that there was a thing, like maybe we call it, the same way that we kind of have access to like this current user. I think it would be really cool to have access to like the current permission. So like say something like, if current permission dot authorized question mark, then do this thing, else we'll redirect or whatever. And I'm actually wondering, like, instead of doing if, I'm basically thinking, let's return this 404 unless current permission is authorized, question mark. Does that sentence make sense? Maybe I can even extract this raise out of here. I'm going to def 404. Let me just pull this down here. I'll get rid of the unless. Oops, wrong way. And then I'll just say, oops. I'll say 404 unless the current permission is authorized. Seem like clear? Cool. Of course, current permission dot authorized is not a thing yet, so we'll have to figure out how to make that come into existence. But if I refresh here, we'll see that current permission is not defined. I could just define it right here. I'll probably extract this out once I get it working to be its own method. But for now, I'll do something like this. I wish there was like a permission object. And maybe I'll call it permission service. And I'm going to need to initialize this with, we need the controller and the action we discussed, but we're also going to need the user, right? So we're going to need to figure out like who is the user and in relation to all these other pieces. So I'm going to send in current user And then I'll send in params controller and params action. Now I could send in the whole params object, but the downside to doing that is that as the application gets more complex and we start actually sending real things through the params, it becomes less clear inside of the permission service which things we care about. And so I'd rather just say explicitly, we're going to send in the controller, send in the action. All the other stuff probably doesn't matter right now. All right. And when I come inside of here, it's going to say uninitialized constant, permission service, right? We haven't created that, doesn't exist. So now the next thing I'm going to do is go create that. Now, because this is a service, I'm going to put this in our services directory, which does not exist yet. Little side information here, or like discussion maybe. Why do you think I'm calling this a service and not something else? Any thoughts? Yeah.
Because it's providing this. I mean, it's providing a service to us. It's like it's an object that lives somewhere that provides a service for us.
Sure.
I'm not sure what else it could be.
Yeah, like it wouldn't really make sense to put it in the models, right? Because it's not really wrapping any data, like it's not modeling any kind of object that's like in our database or maybe from an API or something like that. It's really like pulling in data from multiple places and doing something with it, right? And so I kind of think of services as like objects that tend to have a little more complexity that might be interacting with multiple moving parts or something like that. I think it's a good fit for like something that we might call a service. So I don't have a services directory in this project yet, so I'm gonna make directory inside of app, and we'll call it services. And inside of there, I'm gonna create a file, app services, and we'll call it permission service. I went singular, permission service. If you wanted to go plural, whatever, that's fine. But just stay consistent. Just make sure that if you call it permission service in the controller, that you're naming the file the right way. I've seen that kind of trip people up in the past. Cool. Let's try running that. Next up, let's go open that page. Or not that page, that file. Permission service. And let's create a class here. And it's just going to be a PORO, so we don't need to inherit from anything. And I'm going to initialize. Nope, that's not how you spell initialize. Initialize. Is that correct? Okay, cool. Taking a user, a controller, and an action. Hopefully, oh, you know what? This is going to still fail. When I refresh, I'm still going to get uninitialized constant permission service, even though I went and created it. Why?
You have to restart the server.
Exactly.
Created a new folder.
Yeah. So I created a new directory, right, inside of the app directory. When the Rails environment loaded, it's not looking for changes there. Once we restart, it'll, from here on out, all of the changes, we'll see them. We won't need to keep restarting this file. So let's refresh, and hopefully it changes the error. Cool. Now we see undefined method authorized for permission service. So let's go and define that. These are the same errors, if you can't tell, that we would have seen had we written a feature test. And so I'm kind of just like I'm driving the design of my code the same way, just without a test, which is really foolish in the long run, because like now I don't have the safety net to kind of catch when things break. But it's faster for a class, not in the long run. All right. Refresh. Great. This is not an error. I mean, it kind of is, but it's the error that it's an error that we're explicitly saying. We're getting not found. Let's talk about why that is. I'm saying we're going to return this for 404 unless the current permission is authorized. Why is it returning a 404 right now?
Authorizes now?
Yeah. right? And nil is falsy. So like, because we're not returning anything from this authorized method, it's registering as falsy, and so it's returning the 404. Easy fix. Also terrible fix, right? Because now everything is opened up again. And I want to kind of like show this because this is important when we're dealing with like permissions and roles and stuff like that. You should default to like blocking people. Don't default to like permitting things. So the defaults should not be like return true. It should be like falsy. We should make sure that we're returning something falsy. It makes it a lot harder to accidentally like allow someone in. So don't have like a bunch of checks and then else true, because like you'll accidentally like hit that true at some point and you'll like let people see things that they're not supposed to. So we still want to default to false. So now we have to start to write some logic inside of here that's going to be a little bit more like usable, something real, some real logic. So the code I wish kind of existed is if the controller is basically are we saying stores? Stores. If the controller stores and the action is index, we're good. We'll let that through. So we'll say if controller equals stores and the action is index, we'll return true. Let's see if this works. Oh, right, so I haven't defined what controller is yet. So that's the next thing to do. I'm going to go ahead and create instance variables here. And I'm going to make these private adder readers. I don't think we're going to need them on the outside world, so I'm just going to kind of hide them in here. All right, let's see if that works. Cool. So now I can load this page and hopefully get a 404 for the other stuff.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Why make them private adder readers, and why not just say if at controller?
Great question. Yeah, my preference is to like use a method in the event that like the definitions of the instance variables change over time, because then we can like let's say what it means to be a controller or action gets more complex. I don't foresee that first of all in this example,
right.
But it's just kind of like the habit I've developed that like if the logic gets more complex, maybe instead of saying add a reader controller, we end up coming in and like explicitly defining controller. It makes it like an easier change to make, and we don't have to go and do a search for like all of the add controllers and that sort of thing.
It's just more versatile.
Yep, exactly. Yep. All right, so pretty simple so far, and it seems to be working, right? Like we're able to block off users and all of the other stuff. So what I want you to do next is, let's see, how many people do we have here? 2, 4, 6, 8, 9. Let's make groups of 2 and then one group of 3. Is that how math works? I think so. We'll do pairs, so get in pairs and then we'll have one group of 3. Work together, and I want you to create access to the show page for the store and then also the login page. Cool? Let's take a few minutes, go ahead and do that. If you need to stretch your legs or whatever, take a break, go for it. All right, so does anyone have a solution that they want to share? I'll be the...
I nominate Tyler.
Tyler, you've been nominated.
Well, you could just project it up there.
Yeah, we could. I would typically do that. The only reason I'm not is because I got the recording capturing my screen.
Oops.
Thanks, Tyler. And we're back. Tyler, I'm going to be a typewriter. What did you end up doing?
So we just added to the authorize method, but
Cool.
we took out that logic if controller equals stores to like separate methods. So
Okay.
we have one for controller question mark,
Cool.
items and login.
Controller question mark. Okay, gotcha. Okay, I see what you're saying. Cool. So let's do def controller, and then you take in a parameter.
No.
Oh, I see.
Just, basically controller equals stores and action equals index.
Am I doing this correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Action. Oh, no. Stores, and then in the same method you did like the
And action as well.
Okay.
Or no, that's not what I meant. I mean, stores is what it should be called for the name of the method.
Got it.
Yeah.
So like this?
Yeah.
Got it. And then you had another method called like
items.
And this is cool. Well, I think we were going to unlock only the stores stuff. So the stores show, I think, was the next one, right?
Oh.
All right, so let's go with this for now. How did you end up getting access to the action, the show action? Was it that you just checked against the controller?
I had the end action inside the stores.
Got it.
So end action equals index, and then I would just call that method in the authorize method, and that's it.
Cool. So you would do like if stores
Yeah.
instead of this line.
Mm-hmm.
And then what about the logic for the action for index? Where does that live? Because
I just have like the stores, the items and the login pages. I didn't do like an individual store.
Gotcha.
So.
Gotcha. Cool. All right. So let's do the next thing here then, and try to get that working. Anyone come up with a solution that did both of these, like both the show and index? I like to attempt to extract it out into a separate method. I think right now I want to see what the pattern's going to be before we start extracting things out. But I like the idea and the thought behind like trying to do that.
Sabrina had it like when we were putting in because it was just basically the show and login, right? And
Yeah. Yeah, show index and then the sessions login. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's pretty similar to the logic that you had originally.
Cool.
Instead of like an if return true, we worked on just explicitly saying return true if controller is equivalent to stores and action is equivalent to index.
Cool. Return true. If. Like that?
Yep, and then just remove lines, yep. And then you just copy those lines like 3 more times. We just changed the second action to show. Then
Cool.
we changed the next one to sessions. And then a new action and a create action.
Like that?
Yep.
Cool. Sweet. And this should probably get us there. Let's see. Cool. So now we can see stores, an individual store. We can see the collection of stores. We also have these pages currently blocked off. And we can hit the login page. Great. Let's see if we can actually log in. I'm going to log in as Jorge, I think, has access to this. Turing.io. Password is password. That is what Jorge uses for all of his accounts. Let's see here. And we're good still. All right. Yeah, so this works, right? Anyone come up with something similar? Something slightly different? Yeah?
Jameson put it all on one line with the controller for stores. You did an or index show.
Gotcha. Cool. So there's a nice method that like might be really useful here. So like these lines are exactly the same with the exception of like having index and show. So we can actually pass it in as an array, and there's a method called in. So we can say if the action's in this array, this is kind of like the flip of include, where like include you'll take an array, see if it includes a specific thing. This is kind of the flip where we say is the action inside of this collection. And some people prefer doing like hard-coded array like this. I'm going to do like the little %w thing. If you don't like that, I'm sorry. Okay, so then we'll just delete this and delete. We should be able to get rid of that. So basically we're saying if the controller is the stores and the action happens to be in this array of index and show, then we're good. But let's see if it still works. So that we're checking the stores stuff. So let's see stores. And let's see if we can visit an individual one. Let's log out. Oops, log out's not allowed yet. Let's go ahead and do the same thing here, and then I'll add logout to the functionality. So the action.in, I'll do the %w thing. I'll add, oops, create, and destroy, I think is the name of the action. All right, so now we're logged out. We can still visit the root page, and we can see this page, and the other stuff is blocked off. Cool. I think this is a good start. How are y'all feeling about this so far? Good. Sweet. All right, so this is great. We don't need roles for any of this. And now we're getting to the point where we need to start to probably create some new tables. Because up until this point, we've got our users table, but we don't have a roles table. We don't have user roles. So now I think is the time to do that. So let's go do that from the command line. Let's see. And I will do Rails G model. And what model do I need to generate? Yeah, so we'll do role. What fields do we need? Probably just a name, huh? Or a title. What do you like better? Role, name or title for?
Title.
Or something better if you've got another. Okay, cool. Let's go title. Sweet. And then we're going to create another model. Which model is this going to be?
User roles.
Cool. So we'll go user role. And what fields do we need for this? How should I do? So we need like some association set up here. How should I do this?
References.
Cool. So like user, references, and then what else? And what does references give us that's different than, like I could go and create the same relationship using like an integer. So I could say like user ID as an integer, or like role ID as an integer. And we could still set up the relationships. What do we get that's beneficial from using references?
I know it sets up the foreign key constraint for you.
Bingo. Yeah, so that's big, right? Foreign key constraint. So it'll basically say, if you try to delete a record in the database that's dependent on data from this other table, we're not going to let, like if there's data that's dependent on this record, we're not going to let you delete it. That's actually really nice to have. It prevents like your data from getting corrupt and having bugs and stuff like that creep in. What else? There's like another like couple things that this gives us that's kind of cool.
It's an index.
Yep, creates an index. What's the advantage of having the index?
Faster.
Yeah, it's a lot faster. Yeah, especially as like the database grows and you get a lot more records. Having an indexed column is going to make the lookup a lot faster. If you have a foreign key, you probably should index it all the time, like 100% of the time. I don't think I've seen a scenario where I was like, oh, I wish I didn't index this foreign key. You're probably always going to want to do that. It's not always best to index a column. It makes for faster lookups. And if it makes for faster lookups, then why wouldn't we always index a column?
Because it increases the memory usage. Because to index the column, it has to store it somewhere.
Cool. So like, there's a little bit of an additional like space that it takes up. That's true. It's not usually enough to make a difference, but that is technically true. It does take up a little bit more space. There's actually a bigger reason to not index all the things. Anyone know? So far, go for it.
I have a guess.
Yeah.
Indexing creates like a separate reference to those things that are in like an ordered way,
Sure.
which takes up more space and memory.
Cool. So
to run.
that's really close to kind of like what Judson was saying, I think, right?
Yeah.
And that's like technically true, but it's not enough to make a difference. So when we're asking this question, we're thinking about retrieving data. But what else do we have to do with the data?
We have to change the data.
Change it, and what else? Yeah, that's true. Like changing the data, and also like, what if the data's not there? And we have to create it, right? So like anytime we're writing to the database, for every index, it takes longer for the write. So if we're sharing all the same resources from this server, the same database server or servers or whatever, if we index everything, we are now increasing the amount of time it takes to write for like all of the things, which actually is probably not a good idea. So that's like the biggest reason to not index everything, is that it's going to slow things down on the writing side. And so it's great for like retrieval, but only index the things that you're going to be like looking up against frequently. You're probably not going to do like an exact match based on the description of some thing or whatever. Like, so this is probably good enough for now. All right, let's run this migration or this generator, and then we'll run their migrations. Oops. This is old project. Rake db migrate. Oh no, that's not a thing either. And gem problems. Bundle exec. I have an alias called BE, but it's the same as bundle exec. There we go. All right, so now we've got some things in our database, our additional column or additional tables with like the association set up, like at least one side of the association set up. So I think if I open up user role, it'll have the belongs to side of the relationship there. But if we go to like user, it won't have the relationship. So what we're gonna have to do here is set up the relationship for roles for a user. What's this gonna look like? I'll popsicle stick it. Not here. Sabrina.
For users, but the user also has many user roles and then has many roles through user roles.
Awesome. Great. All right, so let's see if that worked. I'm going to fire up a console. Whoops. And let's just grab a user. Cool, so that's Jorge. I'll say Jorge equals underscore. And I'll do Jorge dot roles and see if we get an empty collection back, and we in fact do. So it looks like that was successful. We set up the association. Rails knows what we're talking about. This is a good start. We don't have any roles right now. Oops, role.count. So we're gonna have to go create some roles. Let's go with 3 roles for today. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll do 3 roles we'll go with. I'll make this in red so it's easy to see what we're doing. The first one we'll set up as, I guess, just like registered. The second one we'll do will be admin. And maybe we'll go in order. We'll do store admin and then admin. Platform admin maybe. Store admin. And platform admin. So we'll go create those 3 records in our database. So let's go ahead and do role.create name, and we'll set this up as registered user.
Title.
Oh, good call. Let's change that here as well. Thank you. And so we're going to go register. Did we just say register user? Cool. All right, so created that one. The next one we'll do here will be store admin. And the next one will be platform admin. All right. If I do role.count now, I should get 3. And if I do role.pluck, I should be able to pull out the title, registered user, store admin, platform admin. Everyone seeing kind of the same behavior that's following along? Cool. Awesome. So the next thing I want to do is I want to assign Jorge to be a registered user. Because the next checks that we're going to have to do are going to be basically like, as someone logged in, make sure that they're able to get certain behaviors. So let's go ahead and do Jorge.roles, and we're going to shovel in role.find by. I'm going to look it up by the title. I'm going to look for a role that has a title of registered user. Watch the output that I see once I run this command. So here's where I ran the command. Look at everything that happens below that. When we use the shovel operator on an association, it actually inserts into the database. This is important to like make sure you're aware of. It's a little different than like if you use a shovel with an array where it just stores it in memory. When you shovel, like use the shovel operator with roles on the database relationship, it will run an insertion into the database and actually make it persistent. This is sometimes unexpected behavior, because like let's say I think sometimes we think that like if we do something like this, that it's going to have it in memory, and then we would have to call jorge.save to make it persistent. But that is not the case. It is going to insert this into the database. Cool. So now Jorge should be should have this role inside of there as a registered user. Cool. This is all kind of like set up. This is if we were writing a test right now, this would be like the stuff that we would have done in the setup section of the test as we go to write our next, like our expectations. All right, so let's go back into our code. Whoops, here we go. And let's open up our permission service. Because now we have to start to like write the rules like basically around what our next check is going to be. And let's say we want to open up the items for someone who's logged in. So we'll like both the items index and the action or show. So like index and show for items. So let's log in. I'm going to log in as Jorge at Turing.io. Password is password. You can see that in the seeds file. And I want to be able to access this now. So let's go ahead and come in here, and what I'm imagining is now like we could say something like if user dot. Now we could explicitly check the role. We could say if the user dot role includes or whatever, if it has a registered user in there, I think that would be cool. But I think even better would be like if we could just ask the user if it's a registered user. And like the reality is it's pretty much out, like if they're in the database, they're registered. But I think we might, we'll get some flexibility if we just do it this way. So if we say if user.registered user, we're actually going to do all of this. We're going to let all of this happen. But then we're also going to return true if the controller is items and the action is inside of is index or show. Yeah.
Just a random question. If we have a role set up with like the numeric system or whatever, and we have a hierarchical system, we can call like user.role is greater than 1 or something like that, right? So if I want to let managers, admins,
sure,
all that, so instead of having to set specifically, I can see if it's greater than this, just let everybody, let whoever.
Yeah, technically yes. We get into an interesting discussion there. We end up with less code duplication, so our code is like more dry. But and as you can tell, like right here, like we can see we've got like 2 lines here that are exactly the same in both of these sections, right? The question starts to become, what do we care more about? Keeping our code dry or keeping our code secure?
Mm-hmm.
And I think by being super explicit and repeating ourselves, we're favoring security over like keeping our code dry, which me personally, I think I feel better about that. So like I think of like dry as like a principle. And there's a lot of principles out there, and some principles I value more than others. And in this particular scenario, because it's related to security, I would rather be like overly verbose for every single role, rather than like inheriting stuff in and stuff like that. Now, that's my personal opinion. You might have a different opinion and choose to do it differently, and that's totally legit. But the reason I'm going like the overly verbose approach is like, I don't want to accidentally allow someone into something that they shouldn't see or be able to access in the future.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
I'm just looking at this and thinking about refactors. And aside from just making like a controller.in part,
yeah,
would there be a way to like declare something? Because I kind of have the feeling that you want to declare like controllers and actions that are allowed for certain classes of things, like somewhere else, like as in like have like some hash somewhere that would store those values related. Like, is this the standard way to do it, or is there like a?
There's a lot of ways to do it. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, and you're right. Like this is a fairly simple application,
Right.
and you can already tell that it's like, oh, this is gonna get kind of gnarly.
Yeah.
You could have hashes that have like value, like the things that you want to allow through. Maybe it's like allowable controller is allowable. Yeah, I don't know. There's like a lot of different ways we could approach this. You could also use like inheritance.
Mm-hmm.
So you could have like parent objects that have like children objects and stuff like that. You could end up easily like have like each role have its own like class instead of like rules and permissions set up for it. There's a lot of different things that like a lot of different directions this could go. The reality is like I don't think most people, and this is just a guess, I don't think most people / companies products are hand rolling this. We used to teach this with a gem called CanCan. Anyone used CanCan? It's now called CanCan.
Because they do the can-can?
Yeah. So the reason it's called can is that so the original creator of can was super prolific. It was he also created Rails casts, had some other gems, was like really prominent in like the Rails community, and kind of just needed a break from all of that stuff, and so created a lot of like super useful materials, and then kind of took a break from it, and so like isn't really maintaining the gems and stuff anymore. So what people did is they forked can, and they continued to maintain it, and so they called it can. I don't know why, but that's what it is now. So yeah, there's other gems. There's another one called I think Pundit, kind of does the same thing where it'll handle permissions for you. And we used to teach these classes using the gems because that's what like a lot of people will reach for. But we saw there was like a lot of confusion around like kind of like the magic of how these authorization things were working, and they would make assumptions that you would have a method like available at the controller layer called like current user, and then you would go create like permission services and stuff. But they wouldn't be services. They called I think like with like can for example, I forget what they call the class. It might be permission.rb or something like that. But anyways, there was all these like conventions that you had to follow that were kind of working like in unexpected ways, and it was like hard to understand like exactly what they were doing or how they were working. So we started teaching it this way, and we saw like a big improvement in like understanding like what's happening. So that way, if you dive into a gem, you'll kind of have an idea of like what that gem might be doing under the hood. So it's kind of a long answer to your question, but I think it kind of comes back to like, what are most people doing? Like, how are they handling it? Usually probably using a gem to do like the authorization, and then just following whatever conventions that gem has outlined. But I think this is a great way to start, and will give you a really solid understanding of like how permissions and how those gems are working under the hood. Cool. So here we go. We've got registered user. We're calling registered user question mark, but we haven't defined this method. Again, we're dream driving. The code we wish was there. If I refresh, oh, I got to go create a user method. So we'll do that here. At user equals user. And I'm going to just do it the same way that we did down here. And I'm going to go in the order that I defined them. Don't know why that bothers me, but it does. I probably have something wrong with me. All right, undefined method, registered user. Let's go open up user. Let's define that method. All right, and now it fails because registered user is returning what? Nil, which is falsy. So when we do this lookup in here, we say, are they a registered user? Nope, it's falsy. So we're not going to enter this block. So now we got to get this to return true because Jorge is in fact a registered user. So let's see how to do that. Anyone have any thoughts on how to do this? There's an active record method for doing this sort of thing, where it'll do a where lookup, but then it'll return true or false if the thing is there. So I think it exists. Let me see. So we can do roles dot exists question mark, and then we would pass it this information like similar to what we would do with like a where lookup or find by, where we could do something like title store admin. And let me just pull this line of code into the console and see if this works. Oh man, what did I do? Let's try this. Just want to make sure I'm like making the right assumption that there is in fact an exists method. There is. And you'll see that this does an active record lookup. Oh, I typed the wrong role, didn't I? I want registered user, not store admin. So let's play with this. Make sure that this is correct. There we go. and we get true. And so it's kind of like instead of you having to explicitly write like the where lookup or the find by, and then check and see if it's there kind of a thing, this does it all for us. So we can call exists. So I'm going to grab this line of code, since the one I wrote in there was wrong. And I'm going to come back to this my browser and refresh, and now we should be able to see this. And let's see if we can view an individual product. We can. Cool. So we're able to do stores, items. We can log out. And now that we've logged out, we get an error. This is your next challenge to fix. When you log out, you're going to get undefined method registered user. Why is this happening?
Because your user has been set to nil, basically.
Yeah, right? So like the logic inside of our application controller for current user is that it's going to be user.find if there's a user ID in the session, right? And when we destroy, when we log out, we get rid of that session, the user ID session. So it doesn't, right now, this current user method, because it doesn't execute this find, this method is returning nil. And so down here, when we say permission service.new current user, we're initializing this service with nil. So there is no user. So when we get down here, and it references the user that was passed in, we're essentially saying nil.registered user, right? How did you get around this? Did anyone come up with a solution?
So first of all, I actually want them to be able to log in. So I moved the store index and like the session stuff above the if registered user.
Okay.
But then for other things like items that I don't want it to I want it to 404, not 500.
Gotcha.
So I used polymorphism, and so at the bottom in the private, I got rid of the add a reader for user, and then I did a def user, and it's @user or and then I did non-user.new.
Awesome.
And then I did it in the same file, so like below the last
Gotcha.
end, just like class
Oops,
non-user, def registered user, false.
Oops. Cool. I like that. That's cool. So yeah, absolutely. This is a great example of like using polymorphism, right? So we've got this object that is like it's going to have the same behavior or methods as like as a user object, allows us to interact with it the same way, but it's something we could use if it's like as a stand-in if we don't have somebody logged in. I think that's really cool. I like that. You'll see this is like super similar. Might even I think this is probably like what I would call like the null object pattern, where it's like, hey, if we've got this thing, we're going to interact with it as if we did have the thing. This is really useful, like using this sort of thing. I think it's cool. I probably would have tried it out, like putting it in the same file. I think the obvious thing is like split it out into its own class at some point, because it's probably going to be reusable somewhere else. Yeah.
Way less interesting, but we got to work with the design pattern we're looking for at this moment.
Yeah.
Not looking to the future, but just at this moment by just adding if user and user.registered user.
Yeah, totally. Right. So like you could do the way we just kind of did here, or you could do if user and, right? And the downside to this is that like as we start to add more types of users, now we're going to have to like do this lookup every time, right? Like we'll do like if user and user registered, if user and user platform admin kind of a thing. We'll have to kind of do this check multiple times, which like a lot of times will lead people to do something like this, where it's like, whoops, we'll have like a nested if statement, if user, then we can do all of these lookups in here. But then we run into this problem like, well, actually this isn't going to run inside of here if we have it wrapped inside of it, if user. So like, yeah, you can totally get it to work this way, but it will lead to some kind of funky code down the road. I really like your approach, Steve. I think I would go that route, or a very similar approach, which is this. At this point, there's no, what'll happen is if we have an initialized user, and it has the user object is going to have registered user defined on it already. And if it's not a record in the database, like meaning it doesn't have an ID, when it goes to do the lookup to see if the thing exists, it's going to find nothing, and so it's just going to return false. So it's kind of like accomplishing a really similar thing. I think that's really cool. Play with that, like that same concept. And I think it's like a super useful pattern to start using in your code. It's going to lead to some really cool stuff. That's awesome. I think for now, I think this is simple enough that we can probably get by with doing something like this. The other alternative is like kind of coming back to what you were saying, is that you could initialize the permission service. So maybe at the controller layer, the application controller, you could do maybe do the lookup if you have the session ID, or just call, like pass in this like null user or something like that. That could be cool. I think the easiest thing to do right now is probably this, just like or user.new. Which means that this user object it'll have like all of the attributes and methods that are defined on the user model, but they won't be returning anything. Or I shouldn't say not returning anything. They'll be returning nil. So like all of the attributes will be returning nil. So let's save this and see if we are good. And there we go. So a really simple change, right? Didn't take much code, didn't have to add a bunch of logic, just like a simple or. And we should be able to do all of the things that a non-logged in user can do, which is like visit the stores, index, and show, and we shouldn't be able to see anything else. And we should be able to log in still. Oh, shoot. Cool. And all of our functionality is still there. Let's take a POM, and we'll come back, and we'll kind of start to wrap up the rest of these permissions here. What I want to do is kind of set this up to work for other permissions. So this is we'll just kind of move quick through this because I think it's like roughly the same logic, like same idea that we've been doing. So the next one I want to take on is going to be the store admins. Oops. And of course this method doesn't exist yet. I'm going to write the code that I wish existed first. This is going to need to be else if. So if the user is a store admin, we're going to do all of the things that are down below. And maybe we'll add on the ability to see orders or something like that. And I think at the route layer, let's see. We've got orders that displays the index and show. So we'll do the same thing there. Pretty simple. All right, so let's go with this. We'll add the ability for, we'll add the role of store admin to Jorge's roles as well. So Jorge.roles, I'm going to shovel in role.find. We're going to do a lookup by the title, and we're going to do store admin. Oops. Oh, I got to do find by, not find. There we go. Let's check and see if that is there. There are two roles there now. I'm going to remove the first role just to make sure. Here's a little bit of a warning. If I do Jorge.roles.where title is registered user, or maybe I do find by instead, so it'll return the one record versus like an array, or collection, I should say. Do find by. I get that role back, right? What do you think happens if I do delete? I'm not going to run it. But what do you think this is going to do?
Delete the role.
Delete it, right?
The whole role.
Delete the whole concept of registered user.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not going to delete, yeah, so like it's going to delete the role from the roles table. It's not going to delete Jorge's role in the user roles table, which is kind of unexpected for like sometimes. If you're thinking about like, oh, I want to go delete Jorge's role, you might say Jorge.roles, find the thing and then delete it. But remember that what we get back from this is not a user role instance. This is a role instance. And so if we go and delete this is going to delete it from the roles table. So if you ever want to remove like an association or something like that, just remember that you got to go through the join table and remove the record there and not the associated like record. Don't delete the associated record accidentally. So what we could do, yeah, we could do like user roles, and now we'll get back those. And if I call dot first, I should get back that first one. If I wanted to be really clear, I could just do a explicit find for that and just look up by the ID, and then I'll call delete on this. Anyone know the difference between delete and destroy? Delete will bypass, I think, the callbacks and possibly validations as well. I can't remember. I should remember that, but I always forget which ones do what. But anyways, like destroy will run through the callbacks and the validations to make sure that it's like everything is following the rules according to the model. But delete will bypass some of that, yeah.
Will delete also bypass any dependencies? So like, you can set up where it's like destroy with dependencies, like if I destroy this record, I want to destroy all the associated records.
I think so.
Okay.
I think so. I'm
So
not
delete will literally just on that table take that entry out and not touch anything else.
Yeah, yeah. And so if you have a foreign key constraint, like when you use references, it'll still like that happens at the database layer. And so that will protect you from deleting things accidentally. But if you don't have the foreign key constraint, it is possible that delete will get to a point where like your data is like not synced up correctly. So I always encourage people to use destroy. Just get in the habit of using destroy. It's a little safer and will like follow more of your model, the rules in the model. All right, so now if I do like Jorge dot registered user, it looks like I don't have that in here. So I'll just type it out. Jorge dot registered user. Oh, I got to reload. I think I defined that method after. Let me leave this. I got to go get my charger. Let's assign Jorge again. And let's see, Jorge dot registered user should return false now. Cool. And the thing that we want to go define is store admin, which doesn't exist. So we'll go into the user model. And it's basically going to be the same thing as this, only we're going to change this portion to store admin. And then I'm gonna go back to the permission service. I felt like I did something wrong here. It looks okay. Okay. Let's try it. Let's see if this gets us close. All right, we refresh. We are logged in. Click around. Can't see that. Make sure I can see orders. Cool. So now I have the ability to see orders, which is great. So let's do the next one, which is like basically just we're repeating the same type of thing that we've been doing here. We'll do this for platform admin. So we'll change this to platform admin. And if you are in the scenario where you know for sure that you want the platform admin to be able to do everything, we could just explicitly return true from this action, or from this like branch. I might again just say, be absolutely certain if you go that route that you do want the platform admin to be able to do everything forever. Otherwise, like I do kind of like just being overly verbose and not accidentally opening something up. So I'm going to just do the same kind of thing here. I'm going to add users because I think that's the last route that we don't have access to. And the users have index and show as well. So I'll go do this. I keep copying the line from the bottom, which is the only line that doesn't have index and show in it. Not very efficient. Oops. So there we go. Users should be opened up for platform admins now. And the final thing we need to do is assign Jorge the role of platform admin and probably go define that method as well. So I'm going to say roles. I'm going to shovel in role define by and so I've got that role now. I'll go define the method. I'm sure that this is going to still blow up, right? Because we don't have this method platform admin defined. So I'll go open up the user model, kind of copy this line. Oops. And there we go. Let's see if this works. Awesome. Can I see orders? I can see orders. Can I see users? I can. I'm doing all of the things now as a platform admin. And you'll also notice that I never deleted the role from store admin, so I'm actually have multiple roles, so that's kind of cool. All right, let's talk a little bit about what we have here. We are ending up with kind of a messy method. I mean, it's clear what the logic is, right? But it's still pretty long. There's a ton of logic in here. And as the app gets more complex, it's going to continue to grow. Right now, we have a very hierarchical. It's a hard word to say. Where it's basically everyone, the person who's a platform admin has all of the permissions of everything below. Store admin has all of the permissions of everything below. Registered user has the permissions of everything below. And it's that's the simplest possible form of this. When you get into more complex applications, that's probably not going to be the case. You're going to have some people who are going to have some of these roles. Things that you're going to want to keep in mind when you start getting into those situations is coming back again to scoping. Remember we talked a little bit yesterday about how if we're in a controller and we do something like this from an admin thing, from the side of the admin, that we make it really easy for someone to just change the ID that's being sent into the params. And if it checks out in this permission service, now they'll have access to whatever store is found, right? You might get the instinct or inclination to start passing in like the record ID, like the params into here. But I would encourage you not to do that unless you absolutely have to. The way around it is that you could just scope inside of the controller to the trusted object. So let's say they get past all of these permissions that are here right now. Instead of doing capital S store dot find, I would do current user dot stores dot find params ID. And this way, if someone gets through the permission service as like, yep, this person is a store admin, they don't accidentally have the ability to edit a store that they are not allowed to edit. The reason I don't love passing it in, like the parameter into the permission service, is that you're not always going to have a store ID to pass in. And so now you might have to like open it up so that you can pass like a hash in of like keys and values or something like that. Maybe that's how you want to build this. I would try to hold off from doing that if possible, and in favor of doing something like this. I think that it could get kind of messy in that permission service, and it might be doing a little too much in the long run if you start going down that path. And if you start going down that path and it gets carried away, it's going to be really hard to reel it back in. So I would try to like go this route as much as you could and leave it at like just scope to the trusted objects if at all possible. All right, let's start to refactor this. It is totally possible to, again, get rid of a lot of this repetition and share it between multiple methods. Call those, for example, like we could break out registered user permissions or like base permissions or something like that into methods, and then call those methods from within these other areas. What I don't like about that is it makes it possible to accidentally grant someone permission to something. I think if we go this path and we're super explicit about every route that's going to be open to a specific user, I think we're less inclined to accidentally open something up. And all of the logic lives somewhere. It like lives in the same, like a clear place. So the path I'm going to go here is I'm going to do something like base permissions. Oops, I think I already have an end. Yeah. And I'm just going to grab these two lines. And then in here, I'm going to call base permissions. I'm going to go log out and just make sure that my thinking about this is correct and that I am still able to see the stores when I'm logged out, and I can. So I've moved over to this different approach where I've got this base permissions thing set. The next up, I'm going to do registered user. And we could just kind of continue doing the same sort of thing. This is a great thing to have some tests for. It would make it really fast if I had written tests to begin with to check against all of these. But now, in order for me to check it, I'd have to log out, set my role to be a certain thing, and do all of that. I think it's a lot of extra work. This is where testing starts to become beneficial, because you can just like run the test suite. And, it was faster to start off with to not test. This is where it starts to slow things down. Let's create a new method called store admin permissions. Oops. And I'll grab these. the same thing here. Any questions about what I'm doing here? I think it's like kind of the same thing over and over. Is it any questions about like what that refactor at all? Cool. This is like this is kind of a nice way to like kind of start refactoring this app. What you might see is like, hey, as these methods start getting like really long, maybe we start breaking out each like thing into its own class, and maybe we're able to like reference the class from within here or something like that. There's a lot of possibilities that this kind of starts to open up. But what I do like is that all of the logic is kind of like, hey, everything that's associated with being a platform admin, right here. Everything that's associated with being a store admin, right here, right? And like I could reference store admin permissions from within platform admin permissions, but for the sake of keeping things like less abstracted and more clear and explicit, I'm just gonna leave it like this. This is not usually what we would choose to do. We usually try to like dry things up, but like I said, permission-related things, security-related things, I would rather it be clear and like obvious rather than like accidentally open something up. All right. I think this is a good enough. Some other things that we might think about doing is there's a way like we could set up this permission service to like forward certain method calls to the user object. So for example, instead of saying if user.platformadmin, if user.storeadmin, if user.registered user, we could say something like if registered user, if platformadmin, if storeadmin. And we could just say, hey, whenever we call these methods, just like send it over to the user model. If we have some additional time, maybe I'll show that. But if you're interested in like that sort of thing, there's a module called forwardable in Ruby that will allow us to do that. So you would just say like extend forwardable, and then you could go look at the documentation for that. So it's kind of a cool thing. I think the lesson plan has it if you wanted to see what that looks like as well. The next thing I want to talk about is the view layer, because right now we have it set up so that like regardless of which user I am, I see all of the links, right? And that's not cool. Like, it's not a very good user experience to see a link, click it, and then get a 404. Like, not cool. Like, why did we do that? So we're not thinking about our users here. And I think that's like super important. Like that's like that's probably like the most important thing to like always think about your users, right? So I want to show I want to talk first about a couple of different ways that we could go about this. Inside of our, is there a nav for this? I can't remember. Yeah, there's a nav bar. Inside of here, we've got our nav bar here. We could do a thing in our code where we do something like if current user and current user is a like registered user, then we're going to show like these certain links. If they're a different kind of user, then we're going to show these other links or whatever. As you know, I'm not a huge fan of putting like logic in my views. I don't like having if statements in my views. I try to avoid it at all costs. If you're going to do this, please try to break it out into like a helper. Like you can do this. The easiest, the next, like, I still don't love it, but the next best thing would be to have a helper that makes this a little bit easier. So you might have a helper called registered user. So it's like you could say like if registered user, and then inside of that helper, maybe it checks to see if like, okay, is there a current user? And if the current user is a registered user, then go ahead and display this. That would be an improvement over this explicit logic showing up, but we still kind of have like moved it like laterally, like kind of in the view layer still. But it's a little bit better. let's talk a little bit about helpers, because I don't see a ton of them get used. And I just want to revisit this idea for a second. Like I could come in here and do something like def registered user question mark, and that would allow me in the view to just say registered user, and then in here I could do like current user and current user dot register. Right, and so like that makes it a little bit cleaner in my views to like reason about the code. Like that's an improvement. I still don't love it because it still forces like the logic in the view. But I want to talk a little bit about helpers, and I think this is a good opportunity to do it because they are really useful. Anyone know like where so I have application helper here. Which views is this available in? Yeah, so it'll be all of the views, right? Cool. So then, let's see if I have any other views. I'm sorry, helpers. I don't. I don't have any other helpers, I don't think. Let me see. Yeah, I do. Okay, cool. All right, sorry. All right, so up here, you'll see that these are all the helpers I have in my app. If I put this method in the orders helper, will it be available at in the nav bar?
No.
It will. Yeah. So any helper in any of these files is available in all of the views. So why do we split it up into like different helpers?
I mean, I didn't realize that. That's a really big thing. But like, I guess just for like sectioning's sake, so we can just know that we're really using this one for the orders portion, even though it's available everywhere.
Exactly. Yeah. So like, if you think we do this with our assets too, right? Like in the asset pipeline, we can split things up into like JavaScripts and then CSS, or style sheets, I should say. But we could also create arbitrary directories in there. We could call one Josh's or Classroom or whatever. And we can put whatever content we want inside of those directories. We could put JavaScript files in the style sheets directory. We could put style sheets in the JavaScript directory. It's arbitrary. It doesn't really matter. The reason we do it is for our own like organizational purposes. And that's kind of the same thing here. There is no like magic like naming convention here. We can put the code wherever we want, and it's going to be available in all of the views. But we do it so that way if we know where to look, if we can organize things a little bit better, we'll know where to go look for specific content. Kind of continuing down this like idea of like helpers. Why do we have a helper method for current user and not a helper method for authorize? Again, this is the application controller. What does helper method current user give us? It does give us a user. Where does it give us that user?
Where we call
And
So we have one mention for like where we call it, one mention for everywhere. Any other thoughts?
in any controller, right?
And view.
I guess that goes down into the view, because I think it was like a hierarchy. So if you have it available in the controller, you have it available in the view.
Getting closer, getting closer. So let's think about how inheritance in Ruby works. If a controller inherits from application controller, does it get the current user method defined in it? Yeah. So the helper method isn't necessary for the controller layer, right? So then what is the benefit to having a helper method?
Just access to the view.
Exactly. It gives us access to current user in the view. So anytime you use helper method, the whole purpose behind helper method inside of a controller is to give us access to that method in the view. Yeah, go for it.
If I define helper method in a specific controller, is it only available in that controller's views?
Yes. Yep. And so what this does then is like, why don't we need a helper method for authorized bang?
Because we don't want to run it before everything.
Not necessarily. I'm sorry, what was that? Exactly. We're not calling it in the view. Yeah, right? So we're not calling authorize in the view. We're only running this at the controller layer. The whole benefit of helper method is that it gives us access, in this case, the current user. We get current user in the view, which is super useful. But having authorized bang in the view, not useful at all. So where we kind of started off was, I don't love the fact that we have the logic for checking if someone's registered or logged in or whatever. I don't love checking that here. So I want to talk about like what we might do at a higher level. I'm not going to actually implement the code because I think it might take just a little bit longer than what we have time for. But I want to talk about it at a high level, and I think you'll be able to implement this concept. So we talked about presenters already, right? And presenters like allow us like the opportunity to start defining some of this like stuff, moving the logic into like classes and po-rows and things like that. What we might try to do, let's go to the application controller. I'm going to write some code that I wish existed, so that way you can get an idea of where this might go. I might say something like, instead of like putting the nav bar here, I might say something like, render nav bar or something like that. And we would imagine that like all of this content would be moved into somewhere else. And what we could do then is like we'd have this render nav bar, and then maybe in application controller we define like a helper method for nav bar. And basically what this would return would be the name of the partial that had the links that we wanted to display. So we might have, like, let's imagine that we have a handful of partials, and one of them is like admin, or like platform admin maybe. And maybe we have a partial named underscore store admin. And maybe we have another partial that's named registered user. And maybe we have another named just like guest or something like that. And now we could have, within each of these, we could have the links that we cared about displaying within there. What we would need to do then is like write the logic to decide what is the name of the partial that we want to return for this specific user. And that could go a lot of different ways. Like maybe you kind of like iterate over like each of these partials or something like that, and you display like a partial for every permission that they have. Maybe you build like you have like the partials reference partials. One word of caution: don't go too deep with that. Like if you end up like 4 levels deep with partials, like that's kind of not great. But there's a lot of that. The basic idea here is there's several different ways that we could go about this. We'd have to figure out what the logic would be, like if current user is a platform admin, then we're going to return a string of platform admin. And then that would be like, then in the view, what basically would happen is it would say render platform admin or something like that. So this will probably take some playing around, and it's going to be different for like every application that you're building. But the general idea is that we move all of that logic somewhere else. Once I get the logic working inside of this controller action, this navbar action, I might try to extract that into a po-row, like a presenter, that's maybe like the navbar presenter or something like that, and it kind of like determines all of that stuff. If this is a thing you want to try out on your project and you're struggling with like the concept, let me know. I can try to sit down and point you in the right direction. But I think this could be like a fun thing to play with. And I would challenge you all to like try to find ways to remove all of the if statements from your views. And I think that that would be like a really fun challenge and give you some opportunities to work with like presenters and decorators and stuff like that. It's pretty cool stuff. Cool. Any questions on that portion? I didn't show the code. I don't know if everyone's going to get to that stuff. And it's going to be very different for every project. Cool. So let's do like a high-level overview of what we covered this morning. So I just want to like recap some stuff here. I'm going to get the popsicle sticks all ready for this. I'm going to put this back to where it was, so if I need to refresh anything, code works. All right, so we started our little journey here by like writing the code we wish existed, right? So we wrote before action, authorize bang, right? We didn't define, we didn't go create all of our classes and everything and figure out how everything was going to work first. What we said is like, hey, this is the way I want to work with this. And if it can work with this, we'll figure out all the other details next. We ended up writing this authorize bang method. I actually think this could be extracted out and cleaned up a bit. So I'm gonna break this into a separate method called current permission. Oops. Maybe I should do, I don't think this is going to give us much of a benefit. But just in case we end up calling it multiple places, we won't fire off a new instance of current permission. But that should be fine. So yeah, authorize, we kind of walked through the logic of, hey, we want to return a 404 unless the person is authorized. And we wrote the code that we kind of wished existed first. We called current permission .authorize ? Didn't have a definition for it, right? We went ahead and defined current permission. We did that inside of this method initially. And we decided we wished we had this thing called permission service. Why did we choose to call it a service, Steve? I think you answered this question already.
Because it does a lot of things, but it doesn't have model data.
Yeah, so it's not like representing any like rows in the database or like records that we might get back from an API or something like that. It's like interacting with multiple parts of the application. I think of services can kind of become a bit of a junk drawer, where it's just like, this doesn't really fit anywhere else, so I'm just going to throw it into services. It kind of does happen a little bit, but I think this is a good fit for service. Cool, so we decided that, hey, we need to send in the current user and params controller, params action. Why didn't I just pass in the entire params object, Justine?
On the current permission?
Yeah, so like I could have said permission service.new current user and passed in params without specifying controller and action. Why did I choose to go with like controller specifically and action specifically?
Because you wanted to make it like less like default to restricting rather than allowing everything.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, that's true. The other reason I decided to do that was in the future, if we start having more things in the params hash, we don't want to like send in unnecessary data. So like we don't like as soon as we start hitting things with like an ID, now we would have an ID showing up in this class, right? And it's like it's not very clear to future developers like what we care about, and especially if that object continues to grow in complexity, we want to make it really clear like we specifically care about action, controller, and the user. Cool. So within that service, we ended up doing this thing, this like user or user.new. Jameson, why did we do that?
So
The problem that we were running into is that upon logout, user was nil, so it was giving us an error page.
Yep.
Now if that happens, it's just going to create like a new empty user so that we don't have an error page.
Exactly, right. And then because that object has registered user and all these other things defined on it, we're good to go. Cool. We have a lot of repetition in this class. Tyler, why did I choose to go the repetitive route instead of like trying to dry it up and like extract it out to like other methods and stuff?
Because it's like a security thing. You want it to be like really explicit what you're allowing and what you're not allowing.
Yeah.
Based on the permissions.
Yeah, exactly. And this is my personal opinion. Like this is what I value. You might see different things on different projects, and different developers might approach this differently. This was just kind of like, this is my choice in this moment. So don't take this as like, this is the right way. This is my way. And other people who are good developers might have different opinions on this. Cool. I'm trying to think of what else. We ended up talking a little bit about the view side of things. If we wanted to, let's see here. John, if we ended up trying to, like, let's say we don't want if-else statements in our views, how might we avoid those when it comes to like displaying which links we want to have there for a specific user, so that way there's not content that people shouldn't see.
Render partials.
Yeah, and then where would the logic live for like figuring out which what the partial names would be or something like that?
The logic would obviously not be in the view. We were just writing it. I know. Is it? Where was it?
Want to phone a friend?
Sure.
Cool. Zach. Sorry.
Yes.
Hi, this is Josh from Who Wants to Be, I don't know, Who Wants to Go to Lunch?
Is the answer me?
Yeah, yes, it is. So where could we put this logic?
In a helper of some kind?
Yeah, so we could put the logic in a helper. Any other opinions like from the class, like where we could put like the partial rendering logic?
Controller?
Yeah, we could put it in the controller, like application controller or whatever. Any other thoughts?
You can like call a partial from a partial, right?
Partials on partials on partials, yeah. My goal, if I was doing this, would be to try to create some sort of presenter for that nav bar. I think it would be really cool to have like a nav bar presenter that gets called from the controller, and then that would return like whatever partial or partials that we wanted to render. I think that would be really nice. But that's probably like a few steps down, and I might not start there. I might try to like start as simple as I can and slowly work on extracting that logic out. And who knows, maybe this is one of those things where I'm like, oh, this will be real easy, and then I get into it and I'm like, oh, this is not as easy as I thought. Like that happens. But my goal, what I would be trying for is like no if statements in the view. And in fact, like one of the things I like to try to shoot for is like no if statements, period. It's like kind of impossible most of the time, but like, or not most of the time, a lot of the time it's impossible. But it's kind of a fun goal because I think you end up telling your code what to do versus like asking for permission to do things. And I think it tends to lead to like more like object-oriented, cleaner code. Cool. So you may not need multi-tenancy on your projects that you're building right now, but you might need multiple roles. And this lesson will help in either scenario. It'll show you how like you can use this within multi-tenancy, but you can also use it if you just have a lot of roles that exist within your application. Don't feel stuck to the things that we sketched out here. We ended up with this user roles and roles table. You could totally just have user roles, eliminate the roles table, and then have role be an enum column. But since you've seen that before, that's why I decided to do the 3 table thing. And I've seen this in the wild as well. So it's just kind of like, here's a way that people have done this. we're to that point in your coding journey where it's like most of the answers are going to be like, well, it depends. And so like that's why there's no like set answer like, oh, this is the way you do it or this is the way you have to do it. Kind of see what you need and bend these concepts to fit your needs. And then like if you have questions about architecture or like how you want to set it up, reach out, let us know, and we'll try to like steer you in the right direction.